welcome back. I hope you have had a chance to
Hello.
have some lunch, a nutritious meal filled with nutrients, and make you ready for this afternoon session. I hope you also had a cup of coffee, and we'll be hearing about coffee in our next break. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce the next panel. Before I do so, I wanted to just remind everyone who's joining us for the first time now to keep yourselves on mute. You can have your screens on or off, it's as you like. This is intended to be an interactive event, so please do put your questions into the chat box as they come to you, and we will be monitoring the chat box throughout the conversation. And voila, so this next panel is very exciting. It's a panel where we are really going to start looking at how we can really make change happen. I mean, we've already done this to some extent, but what are the levers to activate widespread and sustainable access to improved nutrition for all? So it's a big one, and we're very happy to have Lawrence back again to moderate this panel. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Lawrence. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eliana. Can you hear me okay? Yep. Can you hear me okay, Eliana?
Yes, that's perfect.
Thanks, Eliana. And it's great to be back here again. We've got a fantastic panel lined up for you. The issue really is about, COVID-19 has really shown, it's really been just a massive stress test on the food system and on nutrition. And we've seen estimates in the scientific literature, and we're publishing an article in the Lancet. We're submitting one to the Lancet next week. You see that child malnutrition is going up, stunting rates are going up, wasting rates are going up. These are for under 5 children. Anemia rates in women are going to be going up. Women in low-income settings are getting thinner. We see that food consumption is becoming less varied, less high-nutrient foods, less nutrient-rich foods are being consumed, less food in general is being consumed. So this is a massive stress test for incomes, for the food system, for the health system, for nutrition, basically. And women very often are the most vulnerable, and they are disproportionately affected. They eat last and least, and that has been accentuated in COVID-19. The time burdens on them have increased. The access to healthcare has diminished for them. And so they're the victims of COVID-19 more so than men. But many women are the main agents of change in the food system, and they have great solutions and great ideas, but are frequently denied the agency and the voice and the power. They are suppressed and oppressed and excluded from lots of discussions and decision-making processes that would benefit not just themselves and their families, but their entire society. So this panel has the simple task of saying, really, just outlining some of the challenges women face in transforming food systems, what needs to be done to overcome those challenges, and really who needs to do what. So that's the simple task this panel has. I'm going to hand it over in a second to our panelists after I introduce them. The first section of the session today will be me basically asking the panelists a series of questions that I've gleaned from their initial submissions to the panel organizing discussions we've been having, and then there'll be a second section where they will tell us what some of the big solutions are that they have in mind, and that should take about 45 minutes. Those two sections, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A with the panelists, and I'll wrap it up with a minute or two at the end. So let me introduce the panel, and I know the panelists are going to be super disciplined on time because we just don't have a lot of time or a lot of material to get through. First off, we have Chantal Clément, and forgive me, panelists, if I'm mispronouncing your name, Chantal Clément, who's the Deputy Director of IPES Food, Sabine Deschka, who's the Research Coordinator for Impact Investment at Wageningen Economic Research, Dorrit Kempter, who's the Lead Rurality Program at Earthworm Foundation, and Gisela Reyna, Philanthropy and Partnership Director at Action Aid in Switzerland. Welcome, panelists. It's great to have you here, and thank you for agreeing to do this panel. So the first section, let's walk through some of the issues, and I'll call on you as we go through it. So this question's for Dorrit and Gisela, and each of you has a couple of minutes, guys. So we know that women face unequal access to land and other resources, knowledge in farming, finance, technology. And in fact, we see this all throughout the food system. Can you, Dorrit and Gisela next, can you give us each an example of this? Dorrit.
Hello, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you hear me all right. If not,
yep.
Please let me know. Thanks for the nice introduction. And yeah, also thanks for the discussion in the morning. I found it very interesting already. So I'm going to share with you just a little bit like what we observe in our work with smallholders. What we see very often is that the representation of the family in the public space is very often done by the man, the kind of, yeah, the man of the household, so to say. And what do I mean by representation in the public space? That could be like, for example, representation of the family in any kind of village meetings, representation of the family in associations, or even the representation kind of the family and of the farm, smallholders, in any business relationships they have with an off-taker. That is oft done by the man, and it goes as far as that, like in case a household is led by a single parent, and in case that is a woman, it goes as far as that, like, for example, the brother-in-law comes in, or the cousin, or the uncle, etc. And that's something that we really see a little bit across the boards and across all the countries where we work. Of course, in some countries more, in some countries less, but it's generally like a big pattern. And that representation, I think, very often on social norms, of course, like what the society expects of women, what role to play. And it is, of course, also something that is based very often on rules and regulations that exist in the country. And in all the country, but in still a significant number of countries, for example, the question of to who a land title can be given in the household is just simply giving disadvantage or discriminating, so to say, women. And so be it like the social norms or be it the regulations that exist, either way, it always means that the women are more staying at home. They are more focusing on the food production, for example, for their own consumptions, if they have land. And that staying more at home, staying more in the close proximity to their households means that they are simply less exposed to any kind of inputs that are coming from the outside. So they're less exposed to having a contact with, for example, government support services. They're less exposed also of having a contact with the many support services that also exist sometimes from private companies. And I think that's a very important aspect that needs to be taken into consideration, because this exposure to the external world and to information and to knowledge and capacity building is eventually what allows women and everyone to grow and to develop.
Right, I have to stop you there because you've had your 2 minutes. Thanks very much. So really interesting. You're saying one of the big unequal access is to representation and to external knowledge and networking. So really fundamental differences. Gisela, tell us a little bit about what you have to say.
Of course, one of the most important aspects has already been touched upon very often, which is the access to land, or actually not so much access to land, but actually land rights, because the land rights are really basis also for investments. And you know that investments, I mean, are as fundamental in agricultural development. So not having access to land means also that you have no possibility to invest, and that you cannot take credits, that you don't have rights for inputs and so on. And what we see also as a consequence is that because of indebtedness, because of drought, because of poverty, more and more land is vulnerable to land grabbing or to land being sold by agribusinesses, large-scale farming. And as a consequence, we see that actually women, because they don't have those rights, they are double penalized. They don't have the advantages that come from these agribusinesses. They don't get the jobs. They don't get the compensation, and they don't have the land anymore. The land, for example, communal land has been taken away, and so in that sense, their water is less, and often they also face the consequences of pollution on the water. So I would say it's a double punishment. I wanted to talk about another point, but I think there's not enough time. It comes up a bit later. But it is about indebtedness, I think, country indebtedness. And that's a very important issue, I think, especially for ActionAid, when we see the recent research that we have done, when we see that there is an enormous amount of indebtedness in countries that we can least afford it, and that we see as a consequence these investments in public services that are so important for women. I thought that we can hopefully talk about it a bit later.
Yeah, Gisela, we'll have time to talk about it later on. Thank you for being brief, and thank you for raising so quickly the fundamental issue about not just access to land, but land rights. Something that's fundamental and powerful, but I think difficult to change, but you'll tell us about that later on. Chantal, let me turn to you. People, planets, livelihoods. These are all things that food systems affect. And increasingly, we're seeing that these outcomes must be pursued together. It's not enough to just pursue one and say, we don't really care about what happens to the other two. But this is difficult. I wonder if you could tell us why and how we need to try harder.
Sure. Hi to everyone, firstly, and thanks for the question. I think first, the statement that people, planet, and livelihoods are interconnected is absolutely crucial. And I think that part of the problem is that people are still not making these links, and that we're still viewing these different pieces as so separate from one another. But as I said, making these connections is crucial. Sustainable nutrition for all and sustainability, just broadly speaking, can only be reached if we understand and tackle all of these challenges in today's systems in a comprehensive and holistic way. I think when we look at food systems, we've proven time and time again, and I think all of you here know this, but they influence every aspect of human, animal, and planetary life. If we look at the inputs of agricultural production in food processing and transformation, they're not only detrimental to human health, but also to soil, water, and air quality. It also affects the safety of food and farm workers. I mean, speaking of COVID, when we're clearing land for agricultural purposes and encroaching on natural spaces, this does lead to higher transmission of zoonotic diseases, and we're currently kind of living that. Also, our need for a high volume of cheap foods is also putting undue pressure on workers to be working in these completely inhumane conditions. So, we're talking about nutrition here, but this affects every aspect of our life, basically. I think looking at these problems at once, it does seem a little bit big or perhaps overly ambitious, but these are issues that are so deeply interconnected that in the way that we've structured our entire systems. And the thing is, we already have examples of frameworks trying to do just this, to look at everything in a comprehensive way. We have the WHO's One Health approach. We have local and national authorities developing integrated food policies. We have agroecology, which I think we'll be talking about a little bit later. So I think what we're kind of facing right now is this global reckoning of all the choices that we've made to separate out whether it's environment or health and nutrition, development, trade, in a way that we really can't justify anymore. So I think what we need to do, and I think this was raised in the opening statement of the whole conference, is that we need businesses, we need policymakers, we need civil society genuinely working together to allow us to get to this sort of whole system change that we need. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Chantal. And I guess what you're saying is, we can either do this, we can either affect these things together knowingly or unknowingly, but there's no way we can affect one without affecting the others. So thank you for that. And Dorrit and Sabine, over to you now. Women lack voice in processes of change and solution generation. That's pretty clear. Could you give us an example, each of you? Thank you. Dorrit, you first.
Sorry, it always takes a moment to unmute. Well, I think, like, I mean, as I pointed out already before, and you now just said, Lawrence, it's indeed very often there is a lack of participation of women in the public spaces and generally in decision making. Simple examples that I would like maybe say from our work is, let's say at village level, there is a discussion if the funding that is available should be used to improve the road that goes from the village to the main town, or if the funding should be used to improve the center street of the village where the market is, and where like trucks that are driving through with any kind of loads are creating a lot of dust, basically, that really well, basically just pollutes the air of the marketplace, where basically the women are standing every day and are very often either selling the goods or are purchasing the goods. So that just a very simple example, that if you ask a woman or a man about where investment is needed for making some improvements, the answer can be very different. And what is happening today is that very often these decisions are, of course, taken without any real participation of women, and hence they very often favor rather the male side of our society. And what I mean by real participation, that's maybe also important to mention, is that it's not just about counting the number of women that are present in such kind of decision-making events or moments, but it's really also ensuring that when women are present, they are empowered and they feel empowered to really share their opinion. And that today very often is still overlooked.
Thank you, Dora. It's not just about numbers, it's about, yeah, as you say, do women feel empowered to voice their opinions? So, Sabine, welcome to the conversation. Sabine, over to you. Sabine, you might be muted.
I just noticed, yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Lawrence, for moderating the panel, and it's a pleasure to be here. You asked for examples when women actually should raise their voice more, and I'd like to say that throughout our value chain, feeding the cities is probably as challenging as feeding rural remote communities. It's not only the rural poor women who are challenged, also in Western metropoles, it is getting increasingly difficult to provide healthy, nutritious food options. We're identifying food deserts, so areas in cities where it's really hard to get fresh food. And as an example, in the developing world, when you go to, for example, Nigeria, where we've introduced healthy food value chains on fish and tomatoes, you can see that women actually, once they're aware of healthy food and the problem the problem of not having it is raised, they will actually have a real bargaining power there. And so when we introduced fish to the local markets there, you could see that food was bought, that the fish was bought, and that women actually have a power there. So once the food is offered, yeah, just by being a consumer, you can have a real big power on local markets if you're really aware of the problem.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, markets are quite powerful if you have access to them and if you can shape them, but that's a big if. Let's move on to patterns of food production and cropping. And you know, it's difficult to generalize, panelists, but there does seem to be some empirical evidence that says women farmers tend to be more focused on diversification of cropping, tend to be involved in shorter, more local value chains. And of course, there's a sense we all have that this is potentially really good for nutrition and the environment, and it can be good for commerce. So I wonder if Chantal, Dorrit, and Gisela can each give us one brief example. Chantal, we start with you.
Sure, thank you. Again, we at IPES Food tend to be more global in scope, so perhaps I'm cheating the question, but rather than give a specific example, I just wanted to stress that we are seeing women in many different regions of the world leading these innovations. So in our case, we're looking at women who are using agroecological principles, which includes increasing diversity of crops and livestock on the farm, which means using little to no chemical inputs in their production. And as you said, it means building new relationships between producers, not just with each other, but also with the consumers. And I think the interesting contrast I wanted to point out is that we're actually seeing quite a few studies now that are demonstrating that in general, this is a big generalization, men tend to strive for agricultural production that leads to sort of higher yields, more income generation, and then faster integration into regional and global markets. In other words, this is sort of the trends that are following current trajectories towards intensification and homogenization of production. And as we said, this is being promoted by agricultural policies, regulations, and even education and extension services. But on the other hand, and particularly in the global South, we're seeing women individually as cooperatives, as part of their communities, tending to produce first and foremost for their communities and their family structures. And I think being responsible for themselves, for their families, for their community, I think it creates this broader perspective in women, perhaps, of what we need to accomplish when we produce food and maintain this resilience to a variety of risks. I think drawing from some of our work in whether it's West Africa or China or Nicaragua, we've heard from many women's groups that they're thinking and maintaining their communities again first. And so they're thinking about nutrition first for their children, for their families. So agroecological production, again, in other words, one that's sort of free of chemical inputs, can really provide this higher level of dietary diversity for the household, but it also creates a healthier environment for the community to live in. So again, in terms of water and soil quality, it also creates a safer environment for family and farm workers who are in the fields, not having to use these inputs. And of course, there's all these spillover benefits like preserving heritage seeds, maintaining local food traditions and things like that. And as I think Dorrit said, when women have less access to resources, as agroecological practices tend to be more modest in terms of their setup and maintenance costs. So when women are lacking access to resources, credit, et cetera, it makes it easier for them to take on food production autonomously using these methods.
Thanks,
I think that, just if I could say one last thing without sort of romanticizing the role of women, I think agroecology requires creativity and experimentation and cooperation. And I've heard this from women a lot, that they say that these are practices that we tend to use on a daily basis. So it's sort of a natural fit for women to be leading in this change. Sorry, thanks.
Thanks, Chantal. And if I'm being rude, it's just because I'm trying to move us along so we have enough time for Q&A at the end. Apologies. Dorrit, do you agree? Is there anything you disagree with what Chantal said, or anything you'd like to add or expand on?
Yeah, I thought on that point I could just raise a bit of a challenging question also for our discussion later. So I definitely agree. We also observe as soon as we go with smallholders into diversification activities, we often really manage to increase the rate of women in our projects. Now, for me, the question is, why is that? Is that really because women are automatically more focused on health and on creating really the food and nutrition for their household? I think very often it's also because as you diversify your land, you need more labor force from the entire family. Diversification is just more work. So that's also why maybe the whole family comes in a bit more. And as I do see, of course, of diversification, I do see many advantages. We work on that a lot with earthworm. It clearly brings as well the advantage of food security. But I still think it's good to sometimes challenge us if we, for example, focus on diversification as a particular diversification of food crops. I mean, really for own consumption, really as a particular activity to involve women. Are we maybe creating or enforcing even more the gender roles that we have today? Is it not also good to make women move more towards the business model and really towards like the kind of activity in farming that brings income to the family? So I like to challenge that a bit for our discussion later.
That's interesting. You know, can we bring some of the principles of agroecology into some of the male-dominated production systems? Maybe that's a possibility. Gisela, what would you like to add to this discussion? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, it's something that is not a recent trend. There's been an old trend as agriculture that women hold homestead gardens, home gardens close to the place where they live. It's very diversified because it provides the vegetables and the spices and the medicinal plants that the family needs. So there is no question that that is, of course, been a traditional role for women. And rather than say that we should, I would say, impose business models on women so that they also grow kind of more monocrops or more business-like, I would say no, we should actually move more to incentivize diversification as an alternative to the type of monoculture that has been promoted for far too long. And as a reminder of how important diversification is, I mean, FAO has estimated not so long ago that actually the last decades has seen an incredible diminishing in diversity. So in fact, for 75% of our food production, we depend on only 12 plant species and 5 animals. 12 and 5, so we have had a loss of diversity of almost 75%. So in fact, I think rather than having a kind of romantic view, actually we have disinvested so much that we need to pay attention and to help women actually professionalize their diversification, but also actually extend that to business models that are also for work also for men, because not just because of food, but also because of the food for themselves, but actually as a would say as almost an insurance for the genetic patrimony of us all, because we need this diversification. This crops needs to be diversified. We need those genetic differences to come up, because that help us kind of expand and develop agriculture and make it more resistant to diseases and to other things. So that's
yeah, thank you. I mean, I think COVID-19 has made us all much more aware of how non-resilient our food systems are at the moment, and how they are sort of just-in-time systems, and just-in-time systems are a bit of a house of cards. If one thing goes wrong, they can collapse pretty quickly. So my sense is that diversity of production, of cropping patterns, of land use, there's gonna be a big incentive to increase that diversity if only for resilience sake, because this surely is not going to be the last shock we experience at this magnitude in the next 10 to 15 years. So we've been talking a lot about the problems. Let's switch track a little bit to start talking about some of the things that need to change. And laws often, legislation often perpetuates sort of patriarchal cultural norms. Gisela, I wonder if you can give us an example and maybe talk to us about how that law or legislation can change.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at laws that really affect food production and women as food producer, the one thing that comes in mind that has not been mentioned, at least not to my knowledge so far, is I think that women control over their own bodies, so sexual and reproductive rights, because this has an enormous influence, I think, not only on food production, but also food consumption and on the life of children that are born in poor families. So definitely that is an issue that is challenged. But as we see, as soon as the economic downturn takes, we see that those rights are exactly those rights that are taken back and that are taken away from women. So that's a very important issue, I think. And then obviously, I mean, the issue of land rights has been very often mentioned, and we have seen some really positive change there. We've seen women coalitions. I mean, I wanted to mention the Kilimanjaro initiative in 2016 with one of the partners of ActionAid. That was the rural farmers from women from over 20 countries that came to the Kilimanjaro mounted to ask the African Union not only to have these laws that allow equal access to women to land rights, but also to make sure that these laws are implemented. Because yes, rights is one thing, law is one thing, but actually in reality, there's religious, there's customary, there are traditions that actually work against that, and sometimes they're to protect, some rights, for example, rights for women in communal lands. But as I mentioned earlier, when there's impingement on land and land grabbing, land is being sold, even communal land that women had access to before to grow food is being taken away from them, and there's no rights, and they're not being listened to. And that is why one of the demands of this women initiative was also that actually women should be consulted, should be part of consultations when decisions are taken on selling communal lands, for example. But not only this, but a typical, I think, would say for the women mindset in this initiative, they also asked disabilities, people with disabilities and youth to be included. So
it's interesting you've given us an example of collective action can change things. Chantal and Sabine, let me move to you, because I wanted to talk a bit about policy, how we can, coherent and coordinated policy, consumer demand, and civil collective action can really change the dynamic. And I wonder if Chantal and then Sabine can give us a brief example.
Sure. So again, I think this goes in the spirit of this coordinated approach that I was mentioning earlier that we need for policy and sort of in all aspects of the food system. But we've really found that this alliance building is really the way to move forward. And I think the main example I could point to is some of the work that we've been doing in West Africa around pushing specifically for more kind of agroecological production and scaling up that production in the region. And some of the things that we found was that there was this huge disconnect between policymakers and what civil society was hoping for in terms of food system transformation, and disconnect because there wasn't sufficient participation, disconnect because they just didn't have the means to be part of the decision-making process. And so, with a number of local partners, we created an alliance that brought together policymakers, consumers, civil society, actors, and farmers especially, to really just start being in dialogue. And again, these things are so obvious to us, but dialogue is just so lacking, I think, in most regions, that when you have people at the same table, when you have people just expressing their interests, their issues, their problems around, again, the same space, I think a lot of understanding just happens from those very conversations. And since then, we've seen a lot of positive change happening in the region as a result of these dialogues. I think in the span of a few years, we did see sort of the regional institutions. We saw a number of national governments sort of picking up sustainable agriculture as one of the things they wanted to work on the basis of what they heard from farmers and some of the very real challenges they were facing because of climate change, because of lack of access to resources, because of just lack of support for the way that they wanted to farm. So I think, yeah, that's just a very brief example of how, collective action, and by collective, I really mean including everyone, can really change things.
It's a really important distinction. When you think of collective action, sometimes I think of like-minded groups getting together to form a power block to challenge some other power block. But actually, the best kind of collective action is bringing different voices to the table and just relating on a human level and just talking, understanding points of difference and then points of overlap, and trying to diminish the former and increase the latter wherever possible. Thank you for reminding us that. Sabine.
Yes, well, what we know at this moment is that food systems will need to change dramatically in the future, and women need to have a say in this transformation. The reason for this change is pure necessity, because with everything we have, even if we reduce food waste to zero, we use the best agricultural methods we have, etc., we are not going to have enough food for the whole population in 2050. So we do really need new solutions. So there are new solutions coming up. And I think a couple of them actually suit women very well. And that's why it's important that we are in the table right from the beginning when the policy decisions are taken. So the way we produce food is going to change. So there are new technologies, precision fermentation. So we are not extracting food anymore, we're going to create it. There is individual, our nutritious needs are actually engraved in our DNA. So once we're able to decipher that and read it, it's going to be really important. It's really what women always do, cook to the needs of the family and change the recipe. And thirdly, growing local vegetables, more diversity of red vegetables can actually move indoors. So there are new concepts like urban farming, freight farming. You know, freight farming is where you can put a container somewhere, even in the most remote area. If you find a way to put energy to it, you can produce whatever vegetable you want on a very small scale. So this more.
What kind of container are you talking about?
Sorry?
What kind of container?
Yeah, good question. Like, we're at this moment imagining like a real container, like what you have on a big boat, a 40 or a 60-inch container.
Yes, yes.
With all the technicalities in it, and yeah, LED light, solar energy to make it work, and you could basically, on a very small scale, produce a lot of vegetables indoors. Mm-hmm. Which has a complete new influence on land rights, because you don't need the land anymore. If you move away from animal production to creating new kind of foods, a lot of the land can be given back to biodiversity and other things. So there's a lot possible, but it does require an investment, and the investment needs to go into the right things and things that fit with us.
So Sabine, you have the last word on this section of the panel discussion. So keep going. Where is the absence of women's voice the most problematic?
Well, what I see at the moment is like all the things I'm describing are very technical things. They require a lot of knowledge, and they require a lot of investment. And that's where it's really very important that we bridge this divide with the technical and the digital knowledge that are really important for the life for women, and in terms of access to land and production facilities, also agency over food production, because we do need the creativity and knowledge of nutrition needs that women can bring to the table to create the foods that we actually need in the future. And we do need the knowledge about, like, how do you introduce new foods into a family? How do you cook for everybody at your own household? And well, all of these things together can actually empower women in the end in their efforts to produce and provide healthy food.
I really like your argument about getting women's agency and voice into the more technical aspects of the discussion and debate, because that's often where some of the most fundamental rules of the game are set, actually, and women are sort of systematically excluded from that. I'm going to close this section down now, and thank you, panelists, and sorry to keep interrupting you and nagging you to move on quickly. I'll give you a little bit more time in this section. This section is really about, okay, what needs to happen now to empower women to transform food systems. I originally told you 5 minutes each. It'd be great if you could do it in 4 minutes, but if you absolutely need 5, I will give you those. But so this is really where you just reflect a little bit more on what needs to happen. And if you have a particular geography in mind when you're telling us this, your recommendations, please share that with us. So Chantal, let me start with you.
Sure, thanks. I think we've provided a fairly comprehensive overview of the problems that women are facing in trying to transform food systems. So I think focusing on a few key changes is a bit tricky, but I have a few. The first one, and this is a very simple one, but it's just the need to recognize the full extent of women's roles in food systems. And I think this is crucial in designing policies and in how we structure our social and economic systems around them. And I think, just again, starting with just the basic data, we're still facing these huge difficulties today acknowledging and quantifying gendered work in global assessments. I think current assessments go anywhere from saying that women take up 20 all the way up to 80% of the food system in terms of the work that they contribute. So those are huge discrepancies. I think in survey data, women often qualify their roles and responsibilities differently as well than men. So for example, in many regions, women cite caring for their households as their primary role, even though many of these activities actually contribute directly to farm work or household and community food security. And I think related to data collection, we already mentioned things like home plots and kitchen gardens and all of these unremunerated household activities, which again are almost never accounted for as part of food production or food security when we compile data. And then all of this is on top of the sort of double work burden that we know women continue to face around the world because of the kinds of tasks and the kind of work that we value. So if we want to tackle this challenge, the first step is really just to get a real sense of the scale of the issue and in how much we are undervaluing women's work, especially in certain regions of the world. I think the second thing is just, and we mentioned this just way back in the beginning of our talk, is that gender sensitive policies, they won't work unless they happen alongside a social cultural shift. And we mentioned the policies that place women at a disadvantage, but again, we have to ensure that the social norms are working in tandem to these changes. I think we mentioned specifically access to land policies. It has to be socially acceptable for a woman to own land, for her to be able to be the head of a production unit, so they don't face the social stigma when they're seeking that kind of equality. And I think Gisela mentioned reproductive rights, but women can't be equal in the food system at all if, especially during COVID, we've been seeing higher instances of violence in the home and in the workplace, where women are systemically devalued in many instances. So again, this isn't just in industrialized production systems. In many farming systems, including family farming, we do tend to reinforce these patriarchal gender inequalities. So again, we need to change the kind of work that we value, and even who has access to nutrition first, as you said in the beginning. A third point, and perhaps my final one, is that I think when we talk about participation, it's what we mentioned before. We really, I think, at this point in humanity, move beyond this idea of consultative processes. We need real participation in our food systems. I think we all know that decision making is still limited to a handful of powerful actors, with their own sets of interests, et cetera. So too rarely do these meet citizen needs, and especially the needs of marginalized groups. So to rebalance power in the food system, we really need to act as a participatory democracy, because we're all so deeply implicated in food and what and how we eat. So when I say representation, we're speaking about women here, but I mean a broad representation from the entire food system. So not just women, but stakeholders from different parts of the value chain, youth, indigenous communities. And it's really only in instilling that true participation that we'll learn to value all of the food system stakeholders and all of the things that we do, to move towards sustainability. And I think I touched on this earlier, but again, our systems still prioritize control and competitiveness, whereas community-mindedness, cooperation, compassion are still seen as these subordinate qualities, even though they really hold the capacity to shift social and economic relations towards sustainability. And, I won't say that women are the only ones who hold these values, we're not, but I think they're really, again, leading the charge, and it's something that we need to keep in mind. And I think forums like these ones are great to ensure that women have broad participation in different forums and exchanges and discussions to be able to put these ideas on the table.
Chantal, that's fantastic, and your points about measuring and recognizing, really important. The points about social norms, yes, so important, and the points about I think your third point really is all about power, and I think actually power pervades most of the discussion we've been having today. Sometimes it's explicitly discussed, and sometimes it's implicitly discussed. But my own view is the more explicit, the better. Dorrit, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely agree with everything that Chantal just said. I try to complement a bit, not repeat as well. Our projects, we work in agricultural food supply chains, mainly cash crops in Latin America, Africa, Asia, a little bit across the globe. And what we observe very often in the rural areas is that farmers who grow cash crops, farming families that grow cash crops on their land, very often don't diversify their land. They use all the land available to them to one particular cash crop, maybe two, but they really don't diversify and have a challenge in getting their own nutrition from the market because they're not growing it at their place. So diversification in food crops, I think, is very important, as we said already before. But I would still like to just stress again to what I pointed out already before. It's important that any kind of diversification on the land has a certain market approach as well. So that as diversification activities are, how could you say, promoted kind of in farming villages, there is an eye on, can the diversified food crop, is there at least a local market for it? Is there some way that women can also, if they get involved in that, make a business out of that? So that I think is very important. And the other aspect is that we observe a lot in our work in those agricultural food supply chains is maybe surprisingly you could think sometimes, but there is a lot of agriculture extension service available to farming villages. Sometimes there are government programs that provide information, and very often there are private sector initiatives, activities that provide information to farmers that grow particular crops. Now, the problem is very often that this support is focused again to the head of the family and is focused only on this one particular crop. So what we're trying to promote a lot is that if agriculture extension services are giving to farming families, that this is taken as well, that they take a holistic approach, so that they don't only look at how productive that particular cash crop is, but that they really look at how like each farm can be diversified and better planted and generally more productive for the entire family and not only for this one particular cash crop. I guess what I'm saying is that even though the food system looks for the supply of one particular cash crop, it should still keep in mind to really promote diversification to make sure that there is a resilience of the farmers, because only resilient farmers will be able to also provide those cash crops in the future. And lastly, maybe just it came to my mind when Chantal mentioned the lack of understanding between policymakers and the reality on the ground. So what we have been trying, and we've developed that together with a university here in Switzerland, is we went to the ground to one of our projects in Ivory Coast, and we developed together with the stakeholders and with the technical support of the university in Switzerland, a role game where we so we gathered all the information and we developed a role game where policymakers can jump into the role of a smallholder to understand what it actually means to earn your living day by day, and what it means, how to handle the complex pricing information and any other information that may come or not come to your farm, and to kind of just, increase that understanding how much the policies are influencing the reality on the ground and how often they're just not adequate.
Thank you. These disconnects between people who make decisions in the national and global space and people who have to deal with the consequences of those decisions is a fundamental issue, and it seems to me really challenging to overcome, but all of you have given really good examples of how to do that. Thank you. I think Gisela, I think you're next.
I find my unmute button. So a few, I would like to just maybe illustrate a little bit what ActionAid as an international organization and other organizations that do similar work, what I see our role, what we can bring to the table. And one of the things that we very much insist on the program is an integrated approach. So when we look at number of things have already been mentioned, when you look at women economic empowerment, violence against women also needs to be tackled, and unpaid care also needs to be tackled. So how can you do that? And a number of our programs, we do that across different countries when we have the means to do so, and compare and see that actually we actually make progress, because it's about also realization, involving men, making sure that men realize also how much time goes into unpaid care work. So for example, in Senegal, we asked men and women to keep diaries, and so that they could show, they could then compare and how much time actually was spent in these activities. And we see as a kind of direct consequence that that men spend a little bit more time in those activities. Another thing that we mentioned and was mentioned before is the advocating for public for gender responsive public services. But what does it mean in practice? In practice, really, it starts with literacy. It starts with organizing women, to making them aware of their rights. And when you have when you're alphabetized and you're literate, you do not realize the power that it can give, or when you just you have the you suddenly you get a voice, and you through literacy classes, through these organizations, you feel much more powerful to demand for these rights. But then you also need to kind of to make sure that the right levers are addressed, so that you can explain to people how budgets are distributed at local level, at district level, and even at a national level. So this is important because if you do not push those levers, you cannot really change. And fundamentally, at the end of the story, it's a question of reallocation of resources. Now, I think that is super important, not only at the national level, where we already mentioned the fact about subsidies and agricultural extension towards cash crops, and should be diverted or should be more also to diversification and to crops that women grow. But in practice, that is not possible because the money is not there. So a lot of those resources, more than $1 billion is spent every year by Southern African countries to give subsidies for labor or for profit cash crops, which have nothing to do with food production, fertilizers and pesticides that are really not, they're kind of developing the wrong type of agriculture. An agriculture which does not really feed the people, but it is for cash crops. There's a lot of corruption, and in fact, when you empower people to look at how those subsidies are actually being distributed, and you ask for a redistribution of those for those resources for agroecology, that's where you really can activate. You can really activate change, and because at the end, yeah, it comes down to money. And at an international level, again, I think when we talk about taxation, when we talk about how businesses make their money, and very recently, only just 2 days ago, actually I brought out a report about the taxation, unequal taxation for the major tech companies. We're looking at Microsoft, about Google, NBC, and Facebook, and we see that these have a big economic presence in, for example, Africa and in Asia. But the taxation, the taxes that they pay in those countries are not at all, they're very untransparent. We don't know what they pay, but we know that if they would pay, this would together would already be sufficient to pay for, substantial investments in public services like education, like healthcare, like crop diversification, agricultural extension going towards women. So there's a huge potential, I think, for organizations like ours working in coalition to push for this type of changes that really have, I think, the power to shift and change. There's much more to be said, but I stop here. I don't want to go over.
We could keep going all day and all week, but thank you so much, Gisela. Sabine, over to you.
Yeah, well, in terms of solution, what should be done now? Value change, systematically rethinking value change from the perspective of health benefits and local traditional food choices that fit with the nutritional needs of the local population. The population there was probably the potential for us to leapfrog into the new area of individual, tailor-made, created food. And we should definitely keep on going that, and it has a lot of advantages with regard to empowering women. What I mentioned before was the overcoming the technical and digital divide in food. So if you think about food creation, it's not much different than cooking, and actually there shouldn't be such a high barrier between combining the two. And a lot of chemical developments or bioeconomy is really just looking into the ingredients of something on a much smaller level than a whole food. And so there should be ways how to make that a bit more approachable. And then thinking about food creation will raise a lot of questions that we can answer. So like, when is a sausage a sausage? Do we still need meat? Can we do it differently? Will it still taste good? All these questions we can answer because we have the audience at home and the feedback at the table. And finally, we just need to keep on diversifying crops is in the short run certainly very important. And we're having a lot of projects running at Wageningen on climate smart agriculture. So where you use different crops, more climate smart agriculture, you try to reap the benefits, to create new investments and go that way. And there were considerable successes there, but we do need to investigate new sources of food. So not only keeping on what we're doing, but really finding food options that are a bit more out of the usual and could be sustainable for the future, because with what we know at the moment, we can probably not make it to feed the whole population in 2050.
Thank you. That was great. I don't know about you, but I've got lots of questions, but the floor is now open for you guys to ask questions. So please do. I see lots of chat in the chat box. Please just, I think Atalante, we're just encouraging people to jump in. Is that right?
Yeah, that would be great.
Or just jump in, or I'll try and find some in the chat box.
Yeah.
Over to you. Who'd like to come in? One of our audience. I'm gonna pick on people. Rose KR. I think you asked a really great question. Repurpose the large office spaces currently vacated to indoor vertical food farming. Do you want to expand on that?
Hello, Lawrence, and all the wonderful people. I'm in Johannesburg, and we, through our quite severe lockdowns, we vacated business properties, which are still vacant as people have scrambled to make home offices work and like this kind of conference. So I do know of a couple of developers looking at it in the different centers where linking buildings, looking at childcare, food growing, and sort of basic healthcare need to take place within a building, and how that could happen is occupying a lot of our people at the moment. So just the creativity around that.
Yeah, great question. Things that unless women are involved in that dialogue, I could imagine a very different set of outcomes.
Yes,
so,
well, yeah.
Sorry, Rose.
No.
Panelists, hold that one. Let's get some more. Thank you for that. Sorry to put you on the spot. Who else can I put on the spot, or who else would like to come in?
Heather has put a question in the chat box.
Heather, over to you. The question was, what do you think is different about the approaches or solutions to move women out of poverty in the global north compared to the global south? And is the distinction useful? Heather, do you want to add to that? That's Gisela. Well, hold that, Gisela, hold that one. We'll come back to you. Heather, do you want to add anything to what I've said?
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Sometimes my microphone's being dodgy.
We can hear you.
Cool. Yeah, I just wondered, because there's obviously such a big difference in social norms and gender equality between different countries, really, and whether the panel have found any approaches particularly useful, or any barriers maybe that they thought wouldn't exist that ended up, you know, kind of scuppering plans, really.
Okay, thank you, Heather. That's a great question. Anyone else? We'll take a third question if anyone's got it before we go back. Okay, let's go back. No one else? Let's go to our panel. Would you like to comment on either of those two things? Anyone? Just jump in.
I think on the last question, I think it's a great question about comparing North and South countries. And I think what we see now with the effect of COVID, that actually, again, women also in the Northern Hemisphere are threatened. I mean, their incomes are threatened. They are the ones that tend to stay home, take care of children, are the ones that are losing. I mean, everybody is losing out with this pandemic, but women tend to lose out more. And so, in fact, there's a huge retrenchment on women's rights also in Northern countries. And I would say also, when I mentioned about taxation, and this is definitely the answer, I think, also in Northern countries, where in fact, where we see that there should be more progressive taxation. There should be more taxation on the higher incomes, so that they could pay for public services that address really poverty. And the more we need to look at the recovery phase. I mean, it will take 2, 3, 4 years, and we need huge investment in helping people out of poverty in the North and in the South. So these taxations are needed, and I think the global winners, as I mentioned, the big technical tech companies, internet companies, but you know, Amazon and others, they have to help pay the bill, and so it cannot just be the women that then take the bill.
Thank you. Other panelists, other responses, comments?
Yeah, if I can add to that last question as well, I think, you know, the distinction is there. Even though, as we said, under COVID, it seems like the issues become more and more universal, things like childcare, the double work burden. But I think if we want to talk about nutrition specifically, there are some very real problematic programs in the global north that we need to deal with. If I can talk about the US specifically, I know that there was a lot of limitations in the programs to support, for example, pregnant women and new mothers. There's huge issues in what one could purchase with the money that was allocated to those women who were, you know, very much in need, a very undiverse selection of foods that those things could be used for. So again, yes, there's definitely issues that need to be tackled, specifically around poverty and social welfare and these types of policies and programs.
What about the question, thank you, Chantal. What about the question on all this office space that's becoming available? Maybe that's just a northern issue, I don't know, but is that really is there a possibility for something interesting there around food and nutrition? And if so, is it inevitable that it will be male dominated? Anyone of our panelists like to pick that up?
Well, there are examples of these ones. I think so far we know examples from America, like there's in San Francisco, there's a company who's buying up rooftop spaces to grow vegetables, which goes well then in combination with the people actually working in the offices, because that's the way to get fresh food, really fresh home. There are examples in the Netherlands of city farming. Gisela also mentioned vertical farming, very often mentioned. So yes, Rose in South Africa as well, we know. We're working together with you there. So yes, these office spaces are definitely interesting. The idea plays around for a long time, but what we see is that most of these initiatives are still rather expensive. They are expensive because they are not connected with other services yet. So the idea of bringing up health services, fresh fruit production, and maybe childcare and other services together could maybe make it more economically viable. And this is actually the concept that works in a lot of spaces right now, where there's a lot looked into, is like small scale spaces that provide a range of services instead of what we said, like large scale crop farming. These small spaces will become a lot more important in the future.
Can I ask a question of the panelists, unless someone from the audience has a question, which I can't see any burning questions. Do you see things? Do you see the next generation of youth activists, young farmers, young people involved in the food system? Do you see them changing? Are they perpetuating the social norms, or are they challenging them? What do you see from wherever your vantage point is in the world, panelists? Does the next generation give you hope that things will be very different? It's kind of a loaded question. You can't say no to that question.
No, exactly. And I'm not a member of the young generation, but I do see that at least in our movement of activista, we call them, of youth, there's a lot of interest in finding alternative ways of earning an income, and especially as one of the possibilities out of poverty, it's finding ways, let's say, to create an income livelihoods out of agriculture. There's there's a lot of disenchantments also with migration to northern countries. So we see a return of interest in, and I think they are more prepared to take up agrobiology and new ways, and more business-like minded in and new alternatives in for example, honey production was mentioned, but medical plants.
Adela, do you see them more willing to challenge power structures?
Yes. Well, but I think that they see no option, because as you see now, even now with the democracy movements in Africa as well, in Asia, I think that the people, they see that we are not taking care of the planet. They are inheriting a planet from us. We have had, ample opportunities to use up all resources. They see this, coming up for the climate, coming up. It's the youth that has the initiative there. We can only help and support and enable. But they are fighting for their future.
But do you see that? I mean, to all the panelists, do you see lots of examples of really strong youth leaders challenging gender norms? You must see them. Are you hopeful that it'll be different this time around? And if so, why? Other panelists, other than Gisela.
Sure, if I may.
Yeah.
I think you just said it perfectly. It's that I think youth will fundamentally challenge power structures. They won't do it a little bit. I think they'll do it a lot, which is, perhaps exactly what we need. I think the challenge I'm finding, whether it's during public forums, et cetera, is that there rarely are actually youth voices. This is why we have these massive protests on the streets, because I think young people don't feel that they have avenues to actually have their voice heard, which is why they need to turn to perhaps these more dramatic shows of voice. But I think even in the young working population, we're seeing both from young men and women that I think there's much more of a belief in creating community. If we're talking about, empty urban spaces, there's much more of a belief now that if we create a space, it should be a workspace and an educational space and a community space and, something where people can come together. So I think I'm hopeful in the sense that the creation of this community will be what leads us forward and what hopefully brings more equality in terms of how we choose to develop our systems from here on.
You're quite right about youth not having, and I've been guilty of it myself, writing things about adolescents, but not asking adolescents what they think. So at GAIN, we have a program on adolescent nutrition, and we have a mantra now: never about them without them. So, but who's that? Is that Dorrit?
Maybe just to, quickly add on to that, I think also not to underestimate is the power of modern technology, all the information we have online, etc., that is used way more by youth than by the older generation, and that really enables them as well to exchange ideas across nations. And I think that has really had, in many instances already, a powerful input basically to youth. So I'm also very hopeful about it, to be honest. Just as I already speak, Lawrence, I see that there has been another question as well in the.
Go ahead. Is this from Emma, or who's that from?
No, that's still. I didn't see Emma's question. There was a question about I think from Atlanti, about government recognition.
Atlanti, do you want to ask it? No.
I found it now. How can you make governments recognize that diversified farming practices can be beneficial in a more holistic way, and not only look at shorter return on cash crops? I found that's an interesting question. I probably think that we all have something to say on that. Maybe my first reaction to that question was, and it's actually funny, we haven't really discussed that yet, but I mean, one problem of government investment is, of course, the focus on the GDP, which just simply does not really represent any health of this, or wealth of the society in a broader sense. And to take it like in our words, earthworm words, it also doesn't consider any resilience among the population in that measurement. And it links up maybe as well to what Chantal said at the very beginning of our discussion. You said, need to recognize even more and pronounce that people, planet, livelihood is very strongly linked. But I think for governments, we probably also have to make sure that they understand that people, planet, livelihoods is also linked to long-term profit. And then I think that link is just very often not made, not for governments, and also very often, unfortunately, not for private sector.
I think you're right, Dorrit. Thank you. I think the more progressive.
Just
see it, but the rest don't. Atlanti, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just to add to that, I was watching think it was World Women's Banking, and there was a project called Pulla that were doing, they were doing insurance, risk insurance for small-time farmers. And they did a very interesting study in which they showed that because women are more risk averse, they protected their crops by being diversified. And so they weren't looking at the big, return, but they were looking at protecting that so that they would have, draft protected or drought protected, whatever. Whereas the men were doing the big cash crops. And so sometimes it'd be very successful, but sometimes would also be very disastrous. And I think that was really, for me, very interesting to see that and then relate it to how can we change that in terms of representing that in policy. And of course, the more diversified is also bringing greater biodiversity and richer lands. So all of that is deeply interlinked.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really hoping one of the silver linings of this crisis is this greater realization that diversity is it's not just a defensive position. It's actually a very positive thing to do. Other panelists.
Yeah, I would like to add to that question, because I think we're not realizing at the moment how difficult it is to develop new seeds that are climate resistant and that they will work in a particular area in the world. Because for every area in the world, you need to design a different type of crop and a different type of plant that adjusts to local things. So we've seen really good initiatives from women there for like digital seed supermarkets, where they were actually able to define, grow seeds, share them, and define them. And actually seeds sending around is not such a big problem, as long as you know that they exist and you know that they will work in your area. But governments are doing a lot in this area, but I think we're just not really aware of the scale of the problem that is there and how to make it sustainable in the end, so that once you have used new crops and they work, that you actually maintain, that you can maintain them for the future, because climate change is not something that is at a halt, it's increasing, and crops that work now will not work in 5 years.
Thank you. I see that Soulfire has come up in the chat box. Who would like to talk about that? I'm intrigued to hear about that. Someone said it's a great example of tackling many issues at once. Chantal, that was your comment. I think Emma raised it. Would either one of you like to say something about it?
I'll let Emma speak first if she had anything to add.
No good idea goes unpunished in this panel. Sorry.
No, I just mentioned it as an example of a whole system community approach, and I think it's important to look at that one. But be great if Chantal could talk more about it.
It'd be great if you could give us a 1-minute summary of exactly what it is.
Sure, I'm certainly not the expert, but I know of it well because it comes up a lot in conversations. So Soulfire Farm is based in the US, I think around the New York area, if I'm not mistaken. And essentially they are also uncharacteristically a BIPOC-led farm, an owned farm. So Black, Indigenous, and people of color are leading this farm in the US. And don't just produce food in an ecological and regenerative way, but also really make sure that in the promotion of their food, they're doing a lot of work on racial equity and racial justice. They have a number of social programs as well. They're very loud voices in a number of the major alliances right now in the US that are dealing with kind of food systems reform. So a number of those alliances are the HEAL Alliance, for example. So yes, they're just doing really good work as a very small farm, actually, to really be strong advocates and pioneers for how a singular farm can really act as a voice for farmers, for consumers, for marginalized groups, for racial equity, etc.
We need more and more exemplars, right, to inspire the rest of us. And I think we're unfortunately 1 minute away from having to end this panel. I'm not going to attempt to summarize the fantastic contributions of the panelists and the audience. 3 things that really struck me, well, one thing that struck me with 3 different dimensions was that how fundamental some of the rights that are not being respected, protected, fulfilled are. Rights around literacy, rights around control of bodies, rights around use of time. And these are really fundamental things that many of us just take for granted. And these are things that have to be challenged if all the other things we care about are going to be realized. So I'd like to thank the panelists for reminding us of the fundamental nature of the challenge we're dealing with, but also giving us hope and optimism and solutions that these can be overcome and be overcome sooner rather than later. So I've had a lot of fun interacting with the panelists ahead of this panel. I've really enjoyed listening to them and hearing from them. I've really enjoyed the questions you've given us, and I'd like to thank Giving Women and Atalante and Eliana for the opportunity to share all of these ideas with you all. With that, I'd like to turn it back to Atalante. Thank you. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience.
Thank you so much. Sorry, sound problems. All right, we're good. Thank you all so much. That was an absolutely brilliant conversation, really bringing up so many important issues and solutions. Thank you so much for your thoughtful contributions. Really, really fabulous.